Welcome and thank you for joining us for this special Walden University webinar entitled Global Food Systems, Interconnecting Water, Land, and Human Survival. My name is Chris DiGiacomo and I'll be your moderator today. I'd like to welcome our listeners joining us from around the world. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us. Know that this webinar will be archived, so you'll have an opportunity to view this presentation again or even share this with a friend or a colleague. This will be an interactive webinar. We'll be having a few surveys and we'll be taking your questions live. To submit questions, click on the Ask a Question feature located on your screen. Just type your question in the window, we'll compile your questions on the back end, and our presenter will be answering your questions live during the designated Q&A break. Throughout the presentation, we want to ensure that we're able to cover the information that is most important to you. So please use this next hour to provide any questions and comments you would like answered. So before we take a dive into today's content, let's meet our presenter, Dr. Bessie DiDomenica. Dr. DiDomenica is a project coordinator for the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation. She was a business owner of a social media company and the executive director of her award-winning nonprofit to help educate youth on social issues. She embraces a strong interest in the environment and a dedication to lifelong learning. Throughout her days attending Walden's PhD program in the School of Public Policy and Administration, she used her course projects to explore different areas of sustainability. She applied this strategy to find a research topic, and her passion led to food policy, specifically the challenges of feeding large populations in urban areas. Her dissertation was called Food Policy, Urban Farming as a Supplemental Food Source. Dr. DiDomenica is published in the area of food policy in a peer-reviewed journal for interdisciplinary research in social change and in a newsletter for professionals in public administration. Like other Walden alumni, Dr. DiDomenica is transitioning into a new career as a school practitioner with additional research interests in public analysis, sustainable communities, and public leadership and management. Dr. DiDomenica, it is an absolute pleasure to have you with us today. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for that introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. And again, thank you for being here, wherever you are. I am very excited about this opportunity to share my research with you. And I just want to give a quick thank you to Dean Garrett and her team at the School of Public Policy and Administration. And also thank the international marketing people for organizing this event. All right, so let's get started. Let's talk a little bit about food system facts. This slide is a snapshot of some of the challenges in today's global food system. More people are starving and unhealthy, while the world's population continues to grow. By 2050, the United Nations predicted that the world's population could reach 9 billion. The underlying question in this webinar is, how will we feed people in the future? And I want to draw your attention to the numbers. As you can see, many people continue to starve and struggle with access to healthy food. In this webinar, we will explore some of these challenges in relation to middle-income countries, where 50% or 365 million people live. Also, women play a very important role in farming and in reducing the number of hungry people in the world by 150 million. I will also discuss the deficit in natural resources, more complexities in the global food system, and conclude with some possible food policy solutions. All right, so the next thing we'll talk about, of course, are some definitions. Let's talk about middle-income countries, or MICs. These countries have positive economic growth for 5 years on average. They have stable and growing economies. The gross domestic product, or GDP, measures the total dollar value of all goods and services produced over a specific period of time, or simply a country's economic health. Food systems are defined as a collection of food-related activities. That includes who grows the food, different ways to grow the food, where it comes from, transport, social, culture, and food traditions, cost, quality, and access to food. Other definitions include impoverished populations. These people have limited economic access to land, seed, water, and opportunities to grow food. Also, sustainable agriculture, which is growing food within the limits of nature. And that primarily is growing food through composting, organic farming, and recycling natural resources. And the final definition is food security. The U.S. Department of Agriculture defined it as access to enough food for an active, healthy life. But another definition is community security, where people can access culturally appropriate food and nutritional food from a sustainable food system. But a simple definition for food security is the basis for human survival. All right. Let's move on to the next slide on why middle-income countries. Most of us have heard of food deficits in low and middle-income countries. Low-income nations have large, impoverished populations and unstable economic growth compared to high-income countries, which are generally the opposite. But middle-income countries are somewhere in the middle. The countries of Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, and Mexico. They have qualities of both low-income and high-income countries. So my research question was to understand the role of middle-income countries in the global food system, because they have both qualities of stable economic growth and large impoverished populations. A history of stable economic growth relates to a country's GDP, or the value of goods and services produced in a fixed period of time. For example, China has had 15 years of stable economic growth. India has 7 years, while Brazil has been stable for more than 27 years. But these countries still have mixed outcomes. While they improve the well-being of people, they also struggle with population growth and in providing healthy food for people in need. These countries also have large populations of impoverished people. So even with a stable GDP, such as China, India, and Brazil, they have more impoverished people than any other countries in the world. China has 342 million people, India has 141 million, and Brazil has 106 million people who are impoverished.
And Dr. DiDomenica, I think this is a great opportunity to bring our audience into this phenomenon of why these middle-income countries are struggling. And I think this is a great chance to survey the audience. There's 3 choices on your screen, and the first one being, and again, we're asking, why do you think these middle-income countries are struggling? The first choice, trying to improve quality of life for people. The second, adjust to more people living in the city. And the third one, food system based on the global network. So those are the 3 choices. If you'll give us about 30 to 45 seconds to filter those in. And while those filter in, Dr. DiDomenica, any personal thoughts on this polling choice? Anything that you've come across that would lead you to say one thing over the other to why they're struggling so much?
Well, I'd have to say, not only is it a lack of resources in some of these countries, but it's also because of their booming populations. You know, part of this whole thing, and I'll get to this in one of my other slides, is that there are different types of food conflicts, and this slide is a classic representation of that. It's the economics, it's the problems with growing populations, and the mixed income, which means not enough food, not strong infrastructures in society, not having the resources to grow the land appropriately so that they can grow more food, and also a lot of it, as I said, the economic factor. Oh, and let's not forget about the politics in a lot of these countries as well. Another situation that I'll address down the road. But, you know, one of the things I just wanted to briefly talk about was, for example, let's start with Brazil. Right at this point, Brazil is in a deep, deep recession. And that means they've had at least, I'd say 3 consecutive quarters of shrinking GDP. There's high unemployment. People are losing confidence in the government. There's little private consumption because people don't have jobs. High interest rate which again fuels higher unemployment, and also the political infighting and, the potential for the president to be impeached. There's all these complications that feed into this undercurrent and fuels some of the reasons why these countries are really struggling, not only with what they have, but mostly with what they don't have, or the inefficiency to use what is available to them. So it's a combination of different factors.
Absolutely. And the results are in, and it's an overwhelming majority. Choice C, the food system based on global network, that is at a 95% clip right now of our attendees in the audience today. So, but that was some great context to provide while that those choices filtered in. So we'll be back in a little bit to get more of a pulse of our audience, and I'll let you continue on with the presentation, Dr. DiDomenica.
All right. Thank you, Chris. All right, I'll briefly talk about my methodology. This research was based on a literature review of peer-reviewed journals, books, government reports, white papers, and websites. My study also includes conversation with researchers in homeland security, organic farming, social justice, and food policy. I also talked with attorneys who are advocates for food justice, human rights, land rights, and food policy and law. Now this slide, I'm going to spend a few minutes on this one. This was a very interesting slide when I found this, and I could look at some of the interest that was going on in all across the board in all these middle-income countries. These are the key middle-income indicators. So we'll take a few minutes to look at the numbers, because as we see the patterns emerge, it explains some of the overall conditions in these countries. For example, pattern number one is economic. The GDP is consistent for at least 5 years on average. So it appears that MICs have a clear pattern of improving the well-being of people between the years 2003 and 2013. The second pattern is people. Many people are poor and starving. Over 50% of starving people in the world, that's 365 million people, live in these countries. China and India alone have more starving people than any of the other MICs. At the same time, a total of 723 million people are overweight and obese. And the third pattern is food. In these middle-income countries, people have access to food, but many are starving, overweight, and obese. This means that these middle-income countries have weak infrastructures which are unable to provide the healthy food to most people. So their staple diet is likely cheap, processed, fast foods, which contribute to conditions of starvation, overweight, obesity, and rising healthcare costs.
And again, another great opportunity, Dr. DiDomenica, I think, for our audience to get involved and the challenges that you just mentioned in creating a food system for the starving and also overweight and obese people that you introduced into this slide. Another three choices in front of you on your screen. The first one, why differences in culture and food traditions. The second, the need for a consistent food education program. And the third is simply the cost of designing a food system for large populations. So those are the three choices of the challenges in creating a food system. Any thoughts, further thoughts on this graph, Dr. DiDomenica, as we wait for those results?
Sure. One of the things I wanted to mention is I've been doing this research for a couple of years, and recently, I'd say in the last month or so, I've seen an uptick in the number of people they're predicting for the next, in 2015. I've seen the number of not 9 billion people, but 11 billion people by the year 2100. Now, it's interesting to me because, as you can see, China has more people in the world than any place else, according to this chart. The irony is that while birth rates are declining worldwide, the babies that are born are healthier on one end, but on the other end of the scale, the aging population is living longer. So you can picture this in your mind. In China, families are limited to having one child, but the child is supposed to be healthier. At the other end, elderly people are living longer. So both ends of the life cycle are starting to grow, boost. All around the world, it seems that this whole global population will start to increase. But at the same time, on top of all this, Again, as I mentioned, one of those patterns in this chart is about food, starvation, overweight and obese populations. More recently, in the past month, China has put out an announcement they're going to try. It's called like a China plan. What they're going to do is encourage people to cut down meat by 50% over the next 30 years, because they realize that not only will it cut down on obesity and overweight people, but it will cut down on their health care costs. So they're very concerned about that on one end. But on the other end, they're also concerned about carbon gas emissions. So they try to cut down environmentally, try to conserve the environment as much as they can, and also save costs in terms of diet-related diseases for a burgeoning population. So I thought that might be interesting as well.
Absolutely. And unlike our first poll option where it really was an overwhelming majority, we have a split really down the middle, 40% choosing letter B, the need for a consistent food education program, 40% with letter C, the cost of designing a food system for large populations, and 20% saying the wide differences in culture and food traditions. So three distinct choices here, and no majority really at this point for our audience. And any thoughts on that?
That is very interesting because, in designing these questions, I thought it would be the cost of designing a food system that could satisfy a large population, but you're right. In all these countries, there are different cultures and food traditions to be considered. And as you mentioned, food education. This is an infrastructure program that should be instituted around the world, because you will find out through some of my slides, people don't know the difference between healthy and unhealthy food. As I mentioned, they think that, fast food, processed food, food like that food that tastes good is the best food in the world, but it's not, because they don't know what some of the other healthy options are. So I believe that B and C are definitely part of the process, as well as A. It's a very complicated way to look at some of the solutions in the world, and there's really not one answer anywhere at all. So thank you for that, Chris. All right, so let's move on and talk a bit more about natural resources. MICs compete for natural resources, mainly water and land. The search for water is a key threat to human survival. One water source includes building dams to divert water from one area to another. For example, in Turkey, they have diverted water from the Tigris-Euphrates River system in Western Asia. Hydroelectric dams have reduced the water supply running downstream. For instance, dam construction in China is ongoing and extensive. Water is used to make money from hydropower rather than to grow food for people. One of China's largest dams is running low in some areas because of limited rainfall and heavy pollution. Natural conditions are changing, and the dams are very harmful to the environment. As a result, many farmers have lost their land and were forced to move into the city. Another water source comes from underground drilling. This short-term process creates a food bubble, which pulls water from deep in the earth to irrigate crops. But when the groundwater has depleted the aquifers, they cannot replenish themselves. So in the long term, there is less food available. The result is declining crop production because of limited water supplies. Short-term solutions that create these food bubbles are not the answer to finding new sources of water. As I mentioned, another natural resource is land. Middle-income countries also compete for land. The threat from land deficits continues to plague nations worldwide. Wealthy nations, including Saudi Arabia and South Korea, as well as middle-income countries, have limited land for growing food. So their solution is to lease or buy land in developing nations, such as Ghana, Liberia, or Mozambique. For example, in Ethiopia, land can be leased for $1 a year, compared to land in Asia leased at more than $100 a year. These leases can run anywhere from 30 to 99 years. These land grabs can buy cheap land and are very common, in wealthy and middle-income countries. But land grabs, are very popular. For example, over a 10-month period between 2008 and 2009, the World Bank identified 464 land acquisitions. 204 of these projects acquired 140 million acres. These were more acres than land used in the U.S. to plant wheat and corn combined, over 218 billion square miles of land. Now, if you work the numbers, 1 million acres of land equals about 1,562 square miles. And if you work the numbers, that comes out to about 3.8 billion football fields. Now, I have no idea what that looks like, but if you think about how much land that is in the world, it's almost unimaginable how much land is grabbed up around the world to grow food.
That is pretty staggering, if I can add, Dr. DiDomenica. I mean, I'm a football fan myself. I mean, that is absolutely staggering
right.
when you put it into that type of context. I think the areas that you brought up, both with water and land, I think it's another great opportunity to get our audience involved and just to see personally, how does your community, from wherever you're calling in from and listening into this webinar, how does your community conserve water and land for growing food? So the choices on your screen: the first one, community and backyard gardens; the second one, plants that don't need much water; the third one, sharing food throughout the community; and the fourth one is open-ended. So it's any ones that we did not mention. And if you want to throw those into the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen and type a message to us, we'll be happy to read those off to you. While I have you on the topic, Dr. DiDomenica, any of these that you've used in the past, or colleagues or friends that you've seen more popular over the other for ways to conserve water and land?
Well, of course, one of the more popular ones that I've seen are backyard gardens and community gardens. In fact, in my town, I live in a small town now with a population of about 29,000 people. It was a big deal to start a community garden. So they found a space, and you sort of had to bid for the space. But it was very popular, and so, I bought a few plots. But then I realized, there were people in the community that needed it more than I do, like people who were unemployed, and they needed to grow their own food. So, when I found that out, what I did is I just, gave them my plots of land so they could grow their own food and, supply themselves, and they wouldn't just have to rely on a food bank or something like that. So, and it became so popular that they're starting to think about another place for a community garden.
Right.
Community gardens, right, anywhere in any kind of community seem to be very popular. And as I said, backyard gardens are very popular too. In your garden you can do more than just grow trees and flowers. You can also grow food in any number of ways. And I think that's a very popular way, and people are gaining a little more awareness about, small ways that they can contribute to their local food supply. So we've had
we've had a couple filter in. Sorry to interrupt you, Dr. DiDomenica. I was curious just because I've been seeing the survey results filter in, and we haven't had as many responses for this one. And I'm thinking to myself, maybe this is a way that we can start thinking about conserving. Maybe we aren't going out of our way to do these type of activities, and maybe our audience is thinking out there, hey, maybe this is an opportunity to me to start thinking about ways to conserve our land and our water for growing food. So we've had a couple of results here and there, but I found that very interesting, that really the amount of results that we're getting on this, very few and far between. So maybe we need to think about conserving more as we move forward.
Absolutely. And as a matter of fact, I was, in some of my research, I ran across a case. There's a man in India, he's called the Forest Man of India. And what he did was, back in 1979, he lived in a high flood area, so the monsoons would come in every year, destroy the land, bring in all this garbage on heap it on the land and things like that. And at one point, during 1979, The water brought in, once the flood had receded, it left hundreds of snakes that were washed up on the shore. So they were out there dying in the excess heat. And so he thought he should really try to do something. So what this man did as a teenager, he went to the elder people in his community, and he said, well, how can I help these poor creatures? He said, could this possibly happen to us? And they said, well, really, there's no way it could happen. But he said, it's a possibility. So what he did was they gave him bamboo shoots to grow, because bamboo is the tallest grass in the world. And every day he went out and he planted like 50 shoots of this bamboo all around this desolate area. And over time, this whole place turned into away from a desolate area into a forest. And today this area is bigger than Central Park. Central Park is 843 acres. This bamboo forest is over 1,300 acres. And it's a complete ecosystem. And there are animals from things you would never imagine. Elephants have come in, tigers, there's all kinds of birds. He's planted all kinds of, locally based trees such as jackfruit, mango, Indian, rosewood, teak, things like that. All these animals are living in this ecosystem that this man built. Rabbits, deer, vultures, all these animals are starting to come back into this community. And it's like, wow, such a simple idea. He just started to plant trees, grass, anything you could do, and eventually over time, this man, he created this whole forest in this desolate area. I mean, this is just amazing to me. It's such a simple idea. So his message for the world is for each of us, every person in the world, try to plant 2 trees, because that's how much oxygen we consume on a daily basis. 2 trees. That's all he asked for. I wanted to share that because it's very simple to start these things. Do something in your backyard. Find a place, do something. But his message was to get involved in nature. Give back. That's what it's all about. So I just wanted to share that. So it is possible, Chris.
It is, absolutely, and when you put it in that context, and it's something that I think it's a big takeaway our audience can go from today's program, that it's not a whole lot that needs to be done, just a little bit each and every day that can make a difference. So I'll let you go on to your findings, but very interesting example nonetheless. Thank you.
Yes, I'll talk a bit more about my findings here. First of all, countries worldwide are experiencing conflicts around food policy. Natural resource limitations drive farmers and people out of rural areas into the cities. The results creates an additional strain on urban communities and resources. There are different types of food conflicts, including environmental, due to deficits in water and land resources. There are social conflicts that create starvation and diet-related diseases. And there are economic food conflicts, which cause food insecurity. And so, as you can imagine, there are many overlapping conflicts within this food system. And, for example, smallholder farmers now, in countries like Asia and India, most of the farmers own less than 5 acres of land, but they are the largest producers of food in these areas. So when you have weather extremes such as flooding, hurricanes, etc., there are conflicts between the smallholder farms and their neighbors who want to use the land. Of course, there are also terrorists who want to control the food supply after weather extremes or political unrest. Now, a better solution for food conflict is not necessarily to increase the food, but a better solution is to think of access and distribution. And some of these processes involve partnerships. So along with producing high-yield crops, you need strategies that, for example, reduce waste. That's another option as well. Starvation and obesity are not limited to high and low-income countries. MICs share the same problems, even as they improve their GDP and public infrastructures. Innovation and practical food policies are needed in MICs. Some examples include, as we mentioned in the survey, food education programs to teach people the difference between healthy and unhealthy food. Also, resources for women farmers can fill the gap and reduce hunger for 150 million people worldwide. These resources also include access to land, seed, water, and other opportunities to expand the food supply in their communities. Now I'll talk about my conclusions. The global food policy challenges include land and water deficits when rich countries siphon resources from neighboring countries and beyond. People living downstream may likely struggle to survive, and civil war is possible. MICs are the home for nearly 50% of the world's impoverished people. Many have diet-related diseases, are food insecure, and have very limited access to healthy food. Sustainable food policies should include agricultural infrastructures. These middle-income countries need sustained investment from diverse partnerships to try to balance economic growth and food security. Cities may need public and private funding to develop urban agriculture projects to grow food in the city in small spaces, like your backyard, for example. Another conclusion is that multiple stakeholders are needed in decision-making for food policies. That should include smallholder farmers and women farmers as well. And speaking of women, I want to draw your attention to the photo at the bottom of the slide. This woman is a migrant worker, and the reason that she has her face covered, it's not from the sun. Women that work in these farms, they try to cover themselves with bandanas and clothing because they are sexually abused as they work on the farm. A lot of these women have no recourse because they have to work to support their families, but they wear the bandanas to try to prevent sexual abuse. And I bring this to your attention because this is one of those social issues that people are not aware of in terms of our whole global food system. These women are working out there in the middle of nowhere. They have no protection. They have to do the best that they can and survive. So I just wanted to show you another one of those food conflicts that we don't hear anything about. Now, let's talk about some possible solutions. Sustainable agriculture provides alternative ways to conserve resources. One solution is to save water, and we can do that through planting drought-resistant crops such as olives, cucumbers, or beans. We can build a pond to capture and store rainwater. There's also dry farming, where you plant potatoes and apple trees. There's, of course, organic farming, soil conservation, and crop rotation. And in terms of saving land, we can look at zoning policies that conserve land for agriculture rather than for commercial development or housing. Local ordinances can also look at what we call brownfields, and those are areas that were used for commercial use or industrial, like a manufacturing plant. The land is cleaned up. It's specifically to be used for agricultural use. There are many of these empty spaces in cities, and it's a good way to although it is costly to clean up the land, at least the land will be available in the city to grow food. Right. And another solution is to reduce food insecurity. That means greater access to fresh food. It also creates a social safety net that includes food education, so people can see and understand the difference between good and bad food. For example, food system infrastructures can provide a variety of healthy and culturally appropriate foods. And as I said, China is trying to change the diet of the entire country. It's a challenge for sure because in the country, pork is a big part of their tradition. But they're working on it, and it's possible that they could set a trend for other countries in the world to follow. Another solution is to diversify the food system. Again, public or private funding for women and smallholder farms can access resources to grow food. We can also try to reduce waste at different points in the food supply chain. For example, you can turn out-of-date fruits into jellies or jams, or use slightly damaged tomatoes and turn it into tomato juice. And as you can probably imagine, food waste is a big problem worldwide. The problem is there's poor storage and processing of food. Now, a possible solution would be for a smallholder farm to partner with an organization that can store, process, and market the food for them. So this would help to reduce some of the waste. the farmers could focus on growing the food, and the producer could have safe storage, processing, and marketing of the food as well. Another solution would be to develop infrastructures to support land rights for women and smallholder farms. They could gain access to agricultural technology, water, power supplies, and seeds, things like that. But, of course, one of the biggest challenges in this whole process is that people tend to think that smallholder farms are not important because they are small. But the reality is that these smallholder farms are more sustainable and productive than larger farms. They're more sustainable because they try to grow food within the limits of nature. They use organic farming, they try to use composting, capture rainwater, things like that. So clearly, they're an important stakeholder in policy solutions. Now this right here is one of my favorite slides, the real-world sustainable agriculture slide. These are two examples of how a community is trying to use their environment to survive. This one in Bangladesh, they have floating gardens of food. In these communities, they have ongoing flooding problems. So what the farmers have done was they've tried to use what they have to grow food. They grow their food on top of plant residue, algae, water hyacinths. And the great thing is they can grow food year-round, no matter what the flooding conditions are. It's their way of using the resources available to them to grow food. It's like a very interesting ecosystem. So even though flooding can be damaging in many, many ways, the farmers are using it in a more creative and innovative way to grow food year-round. And the second one there is a river ecosystem in Japan, the Nagaro River System of linked ecosystems. The ecosystem is made up of rivers, forests, and farmlands. And what happens is that people are using, the ayu is a fishery that thrives in the Nagara River waters. It's maintained upstream by forest management. And what goes on is that the farmers and people are using the land to fish, sell the fish, develop their cultures around this whole linked ecosystem. And this is really neat because, as you can see, it's a linked ecosystem. That's rivers, farmlands, forests, and the community are using the resources that they have to grow food, to survive, and in their own way, they're giving back to the ecosystem. So it's a really important and intricate link of the ecosystem. I thought that was really just a neat way to show how there are real-world sustainable projects out there. And just a little food for thought. The overview of our current global food system highlights the connections between nature and our survival. These connections include food securities in middle-income countries, shrinking water and land resources, and strategies to feed our growing population. I leave you with these final thoughts. Public or private funding for alternative ways to grow food, such as urban agriculture, farming, urban gardens, community gardens, they include trade-offs between different stakeholders. If the United Nations prediction for 9 billion people by 2015 is true, then we really need to think about different ways to grow food as soon as possible. So I leave you with this question. How will we feed people in the future? We should think about how we can grow food for ourselves, our families, and communities.
And Dr. DiDomenica, we just wanted to send that question to our audience, so we just sent it to you. And it's an open-ended response, so if anyone would be interested in answering in the Q&A box, give us a little bit of time to filter in those results. Let us know what you think about this question. How will we feed people in the future? Dr. DiDomenica, I'll throw it back to you. Any personal thoughts on this? How do you see this playing out as we move forward?
Well, as I mentioned, if people could start to look at ways that they can just grow their own food simply. For example, you can grow herbs in your kitchen. Just put something in your window, start to grow herbs, just as something. The whole problem is, as I said, it's not growing enough food. It's growing good food for people. So if you just sort of go out and, start to even grow tomatoes, you can do that indoors. Herbs are easy to grow in your house. You can start projects like that as well. I think that One of the challenges is that people have, unfortunately, become disconnected from the land. It is hard for people to get back to that. So even if you start to do simple growing processes in your home, you start to feel a different connection with the earth. I think if people grow food, they could start to understand that there really is a connection there. It's not the planet and us. We're all the same ecosystem. And it would be nice for people to start thinking about that. As I said, the gentleman that's the forest man of India, that is such a wonderful story. It's simple. He thought, there's a problem here. How can I solve it? So he used his brain very creatively to plant seeds. He built this whole forest. As a matter of fact, he started, a very simple way of irrigating the forest as well. What he did was he had, I'd say maybe these earthen pots of water, say a gallon of water. He put holes in the pots. He plugged the holes with straw, and he'd leave them throughout the forest. So the pots filled with water, they would slowly, the water would filter through into the land. And this whole area of 1,300 acres, somehow he managed to irrigate it. It's just a miracle. It's like, wow, very simple idea. Very simple way to do that. But I say that to you because people think that planting food and growing this and that is complicated, but it really isn't. But once you get started in it, it does start to grow on you. That's for sure. So I encourage people to, check things out. Even if you just start with herbs, that's an easy way to start growing food in your own community, giving back.
That's great advice, and we haven't had too many responses in this open-ended question. We're going to give it a little bit more time, and again, feel free to send this in during our Q&A section, which is coming up in just a moment. Feel free to send an answer to this question that we've posed to you. But while we're at it, Dr. DiDomenica, I wanted you to, if you could, as a Walden alumni, just speak a little bit to Walden's Global Days of Service, because it does have some bearing on the topics that were presented here today.
Absolutely, because the reality is that the thing that attracted me to Walden was its mission to give back, the whole thing about being a social entrepreneur, to give back to the world, and that's what you're supposed to do with your education. And then I realized also that Walden, 90% of the student population is the international community. And so this whole recognition of the Global Day of Service is perfect. It's sometime in mid-October, and what happens is, as it says, faculty and staff, you go out into your community and you give something back. You try to do volunteer work, try to help someone else. Build some goodwill in the world, and it's an excellent program. I would highly recommend it to anyone because it really makes you feel good. And in today's, the world today, there's so much turmoil going on. It's nice for one person to just sort of give back something to their community or give something back to someone else. So I'd highly recommend it. If you join Walden, definitely check out the Global Days of Service.
And again, it's in mid-October, so again, right. Keep your eyes out on that on our website. If you want to get involved in that, it's one of the key highlights that Walden can contribute, not only to your education but to your life. It's something to keep in mind. But as we move forward, we do have a few questions, Dr. DiDomenica, if you'd be so kind to bear with us for a few minutes and get these questions answered as we close up for today. The first question coming from Andrew: what methods can citizens use to participate in decision-making processes? And of course, you mentioned earlier about many of these issues stemming from political issues, people that are in power. What can the average citizen do to participate in these decision-making processes?
Right, that's a great question, and I am a firm believer in local solutions. I think that if people can do one thing in their community, to do something like, for example, if there's some kind of an event going on where people are concerned about, well, what is the problem? If you have an environmental problem in your community, you might want to go and see what's going on, to learn, to find out what the problems are and how you can potentially come up with solutions. Because I think a lot of the challenges of engagement, Chris, is that people think, well, it's too complicated, or I don't know, or it's not about me, but it's about all of us. And once you get out there, put yourself out there, learn what's going on, you can come up with solutions. I would highly suggest to anybody, for whatever your interests are, get involved in your community and see what's going on to come up with solutions. That's the only way to do it. Once you get information, you can come up with solutions, creative solutions.
That makes so much sense. Next question coming in, and this is applicable really to wherever that you may be listening to this webinar, but Tony asks, what is the role of wasted food or food that spoils in transit? How does that impact this overall scope?
Oh, boy, wasted food. You know, that is the problem, is that if it's not, people think, for example, this is the problem that I've seen. They think that if the food doesn't look, absolutely fresh and bananas are absolutely perfect, that there's something wrong with it. Well, that's not true. So some of the food, even if it's damaged or bumped or something like that in transit, doesn't mean that they need to throw it away. They can give the food away for a food bank, or there are stores that have opened up around this area where people are getting food that they call it's sort of slightly damaged, and they're selling it to the community, and it is perfectly fine. So it all depends on how you look at food. I don't necessarily consider it spoiled per se, but some people think that that's, if it looks bad, it's got to be bad, but that's not true. As I said, the food waste, think about it in terms of you have damaged fruits and vegetables, for example, you can turn that into tomato sauce or jellies and jams. Think about it that way. See? So it won't be wasted. You can recycle the food itself and not just throw it out.
That's a great point. Another question that is filtered in, and it kind of blends with two questions that have come in, so I'm going to blend them into one. And Friendly was wondering, why don't American politicians ever talk about food policy? And I think it's a good way to blend into another question that we had about how can food policy makers better inform and persuade people to grow their own food. So it's a two-part question, but I guess I would phrase it in a way, why is it not a more popular topic to talk about if it's something that you don't see get a whole lot of publicity, a whole lot of buzz out there?
Exactly.
Why is that? And how can we inform and persuade people to grow their own food? How can we get that message out?
Exactly. That's a great question, because as you said, on television there's all these food shows and these chefs and all this kind of stuff going on. I think one of the biggest problems with food is that it's invisible. And you don't realize it's there. It's so innocuous, ubiquitous. You can't see it. But when it's gone, then you realize, oh, there's a big problem here. You see? That's what I think the problem is with food. And in its own way, it's almost too accessible. It's like, oh, you can just go to the store and pick up food. Well, it's not that simple. It's a very hidden kind of a complicated process. Now, why don't politicians talk about food? As I said, I think people are very confused about what the food system is all about. As I mentioned, it's about where the food comes from, where it's grown, how it's grown, how it's sold, quality of food, all these things. And as I said, as long as people think they can just go to the store and pick up food, then it's not a problem. But then if you step back for a minute and look at problems where there are weather extremes, like the one that pops in my mind is Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans about 2005 or so. That city was completely cut off. Their food system was destroyed. What the federal government had to do was ship in trucks tons of food for people to survive. They had to ship in things like baby diapers, baby food, medicines, things like that, because there was nothing there for the people. And when you're in a situation like that, you realize how precious food really is. So I step back again and tell people to think about local solutions. This is our problem, depending on a global food system. Food comes from the other side of the world. Well, there's a potential, of course, for foodborne diseases to come through. All these kinds of things. But if you try to grow your food more locally, at least you know where it's coming from. And a lot of people are starting to be more aware of that. Now, the other part of your question about building awareness, I personally think this would be an excellent media campaign. As I said, a food education program to tell people good food, bad food, what's healthy, how to feed children, how to teach them to understand that, McDonald's is not real food. That's junk food. What you need is something healthy. I think an overall media campaign would be excellent. Excellent. That's another research project in itself. But I think the media should definitely get involved in telling people, helping them understand what's healthy and unhealthy food. And it's, as I said, in this situation, the China plan, where they're trying to encourage people to cut 50% of their meat consumption. That's a perfect example. If they're going to be successful, they have to start now. They have to start early, because this is a long-term, slow learning process. So I'm curious to see how this process is going to work out for China.
That's a great point. And a few other questions have filtered in. Great questions to this point, and thank you to all of our audience for sending these in. The next one is from Anatolia, and she mentions the interplay of capitalism and political diversity impacting the global food system and making it difficult to maintain. Do you have any thoughts on that question and comments to that?
Well, of course, one of the problems, and as I mentioned in my the slides, the capitalism, it's about making money. And a lot of these big agribusiness can take over smaller smallholder farms. So it seems in some ways that the smallholder farms and women farmers don't have a chance at all. And that's why it's important for them to try to find a way to get into the food system. And if nothing else, if they can grow food for their community, for their neighborhood, for their farm, that's a big start. Because 80% of the food that's grown in Asia and India comes from these smallholder farms. Because if you think about that for a second. All these smallholder farms are gone, and all of a sudden, big agriculture comes in. All of a sudden, they're giving these people pesticides, bad foods, all this stuff. It's going to spike health issues, right? The animals are going to be harmed. All these factors to consider. Whereas if you focus primarily, really, on the expertise in your community, the smallholder farms, the women farmers, that's a way to build up the capital that can help the system be more sustainable. I think relying on external sources in some ways is a big negative. If you can do it locally, internally, I suggest that's the way to go. Not an easy answer, I know, but that's what I was thinking about today.
And the final question that we have for our audience today, and you've mentioned McDonald's at a few points and unhealthy diets. The question being, do you think that a turn to a more vegetarian-type diet would help to reduce this problem of starvation and obesity? Well, as I said, one of the problems of starvation is obesity is not having access to quality food. So what you have is cheap processed food, and you're just eating a lot of that, and it's like, yeah, well, it's food, but it's not really food. You see what I'm saying? So the problem I see with starvation and obesity, and in terms of changing to a more vegetarian type of diet, is that people will be healthier in the long term. They'll be full from eating good foods versus, salty and sugar-based foods, things like that. It does make a big difference. And I go back to my question again. I'm very curious to see how China can lead the world in trying to reduce meat consumption in the world. Because as you probably already know, and I think I mentioned this, is that a lot of the agriculture, a lot of the food goes to livestock versus feeding people. People are the ones that need the food. I don't necessarily think that we need all this meat because it's expensive, harms the environment, because of all the methane gas that comes up from all these different systems. So if we try something simpler, it's very possible that we could start being healthier overall. And I think that's maybe what China is trying to do, trying to solve some environmental problems and also reduce their healthcare issues as well. And it's amazing how they're interrelated with one another and how one can filter into the next. That is it for the questions that have filtered in, Dr. DiDomenica. Before we close up shop, any last thoughts, any key takeaways that you can give our audience as we move on from this program and hopefully take some of these ideas with us? Well, as I said, I believe that the food policy solutions in the world are local. And if people start to, access women farmers, smallholder farmers around the world, these are the resources, these are the gems that can really start to change the food system. But if you ignore them because they're small, it's like they don't even exist at all. So it forces communities to look elsewhere to get their food from long distances. And I don't think that's a solution at all. There's transport costs, there's the quality of food, and it also, because of the cost, it blocks out a lot of the smallholder farms. So I think if people start looking more locally at ways that they can improve their own food situation, somehow contribute to their local food supply, grow food in your backyard, in your window, go to farmers market, things like that, support your local farmers, I think that's definitely a way to improve the local food system. Definitely, overall. Dr. Bessie DiDomenica, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing this wealth of information. I think you've left a lot of us with items that we need to think about going forward and ways that we can improve going forward. I wish you all the best in your continued research efforts in this field, and thank you again so much for being with us today.
Thank you all. Thank you for spending your afternoon with me. Take care and have a good day.
And on the screen in front of you is Dr. DiDomenica's contact information if you'd like to reach out to her with any questions or comments moving forward. That brings us to the end of our webinar. Thank you to all of our listeners for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us, and thank you for submitting all of your wonderful questions. On the screen in front of you, you can learn more about the online degree of the Public Policy and Administration from Walden University. We had mentioned earlier about the Global Days of Service. You can become a leader in public service. You can earn a doctorate, a master's, a bachelor's, or even a certificate. To get started, call an enrollment advisor at 1-855-591-7858. So those are the next steps if you like what you heard here today and want to gain more information on how to get involved with the Public Policy and Administration degree from Walden. We do remind you this webinar will be archived if you want to go back and view parts of the program, and the link will be sent to you in a follow-up email. We do invite you to fill out a brief survey that will automatically generate after the webinar ends. That'll help tell us what you liked and what you'd like to see improved as we strive to make these programs as informative and productive as possible. I encourage you to connect with our faculty, students, and alumni by joining the Walden University community on our website or even connecting with us through social networking sites like Facebook and LinkedIn. Of course, if your education continues with Walden, we'll see you in class. Thanks, everyone, for spending time with us today, and goodbye.